Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're going to be going over movement and exploration in Metroid Prime 4. And while I may have covered this to some extent in different videos in the past, this time we're going to be focusing entirely on movement and exploration for Metroid Prime 4. So, why is this so important? Well, here's the thing. Metroid, as a whole, has never really sold as well as either Mario or Zelda, yet it shares the same roots to these franchises, and in terms of critical acclaim, it's always been right up there for Nintendo, but in terms of sales, it's always paled in comparison. And on top of that, Metroid Prime as a series has been dormant for quite some time. Metroid Prime 3 came out in 2007, and now here we are in 2018 and we still haven't gotten a main Metroid Prime game. Of course, Metroid Prime 4 is in the works, and a lot of us believe that it's probably coming out holiday 2019. So then, I believe Nintendo is making sure that this series is finally going to sell and perform well, and it's going to be one of Nintendo's big holiday games next year, and they really want it to be on a similar level comparable to both Mario and Zelda. Now, when we look at both Mario and Zelda, even those two series that have done well over the years, both were reinvented and redone when it came to Super Mario Odyssey and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. They reassessed the foundations for those particular games, and in particular, they really focused on exploration and movement in those particular series. So then, I also believe Nintendo will be looking at how they go about exploration and movement in Metroid Prime 4 as well. So basically, we're going to be going over how Metroid Prime 4 could be changing in terms of both movement and exploration this time around. In Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild, they made sure to add many different forms of movement, different ways to go about exploring the game world. So then, for Metroid Prime 4, could they be doing something similar? Maybe, but I think it's important to note that there's already several different ways to actually move about in the Metroid Prime series. You have the grapple beam, you have the space jump, you have the screw attack, you have the morph ball. There's already many different ways to actually move about in the Metroid Prime series. So could they be adding more or looking at ways to change it up to make it more interesting and more inviting for more players? Potentially. So actually, a lot of 2D Metroid fans feel that in the Metroid Prime series, Samus feels kind of slow and tanky compared to her 2D counterpart, which feels very nimble and agile and just, well, quick and powerful. So then, maybe they could do some things to make her feel more agile, more quicker, less tanky, and also do things to make the actual platforming elements in the Metroid Prime series more inviting to players, and just basically creating more options for different kinds of players and giving you way more ways to actually explore the game world. I think there's some potential there, so what exactly could they be changing? Well, first, let's focus on how Samus feels kind of tanky in the Metroid Prime games. There's a few different things they could do to change that up. So of course, I think they should bring back everything else that they've had beforehand, like the grapple beam, like the morph ball, and so on, but I think there's other things they could do. So for example, in Metroid Other M, which is kind of like a 2.5D Metroid game, there's this one power-up that was really cool. That was actually also used in a lot of the 2D Metroid games, but this is the first time we've ever seen it used in a 3D Metroid game, and that was the Speed Booster. So the Speed Booster is literally Samus running really fast, and she has the power to barrel through walls and objects, and this is something really, really cool, but obviously we're seeing it being done in third person, and it's a lot easier to move about when you're in this mode because you can see things around you. So maybe they can sort of play around with having more third-person elements introduced into Metroid Prime 4. So what's interesting about this idea to me is that when Metroid Prime 1 was in development, before Shigeru Miyamoto stepped in to tell Retro Studios to make it into a first-person shooter, they were actually making a third-person Metroid game. So then, what if they were to sort of bring that back to an extent? I think Metroid Prime should stay as a first-person shooter adventure, don't get me wrong there, but that doesn't mean they can't actually integrate some third-person elements. And actually, there's already been some third-person elements in the Metroid games. Whenever you're in Morph Ball, you're in third person, and when you switch between Morph Ball and your normal first-person form, you do see Samus briefly in third person as well. So maybe they can integrate more options in third person as well. Perhaps when you jump into Speed Booster mode, the camera pans out so you can see Samus in third person as she's moving about in the game world. That way she has a better ability to sort of see in her peripheral vision and avoid objects and items. That's a possibility. Another thing they could maybe do is also offer you the ability to jump around in third person as well. Myself, I've never really had a problem with the way space jumping works, where you can do the double jump and such to land on platforms in the Metroid Prime series, but I have heard the complaint several times where it's just kind of hard to sort of gauge your depth as you jump through different platforms in Metroid Prime. So maybe when you start using your space boots to do that double jump, you can actually have the option to do it in third person, and when you do this, you're a lot more likely to see where you're going and have better peripheral vision for what could be on the different sides, be it an enemy, an object, or another platform to land on. So by offering more third person elements and different power-ups in that way, they could definitely open things up a little bit more and make it more inviting to more players. But going back to a faster paced Samus, there's a few other things I think they can maybe do. So I don't think they would copy it straight up, but they could perhaps add some Mirror's Edge-like elements, some free-running like elements to Samus in first person as well. There could be something there to make Samus more agile and a faster character in the Metroid Prime series. But one thing in particular I think is very likely that they're going to be introducing in Metroid Prime 4 is a melee attack. So they actually added a melee attack to the 3DS remake for Metroid 2, and it was really cool. The return of Samus was pretty amazing when you got to see Samus really get up and close and personal dealing with a lot of enemies. But in the Metroid Prime series, that melee attack could really add a lot more fluidity to your movement as you're going about exploring the game world. Maybe you can run up against some enemies and do a melee attack so you can sort of keep moving as you're doing that, but maybe at the same time you can enter some sort of action sequence where you do get up and close and personal, grab them and blast them in the mouth like we see in Metroid Samus Returns, or maybe even kind of like how they do it in Metroid Other M. Those are some potential options as well, and at the very least it'd be kind of a cool little way to sort of show some more cinematic elements as Samus is basically kicking butt. That could be really cool to see. Now there's a few other forms of movement that I can maybe see the Metroid team adding into Metroid Prime 4. So one in particular actually has to do with Zero Suit Samus. In a prior video I talked about how maybe we could be seeing Zero Suit Samus actually playable in Metroid Prime 4. Now do I think this is likely? I don't really know, I'm not entirely sure, but I do think it's at least possible, and there could be some options there. I don't think they absolutely have to do it, but they might do. We've seen Zero Suit Samus used beforehand, and there could be some interesting gameplay possibilities. So in this modern era, most games have some sort of stealth element. So what if they were to introduce a stealth element in Metroid Prime 4, and you could access that by going into Zero Suit mode? When you're playing as Zero Suit Samus, obviously you're lacking in power and such, but maybe you can move around a lot more quietly, access more narrow areas and go through there and get up and close and personal to some space pirates and kill them from behind. Things like that are definitely possible and could be really interesting to see. So maybe they could add Zero Suit Samus as a stealth option in Metroid Prime 4. I'm not going to say it's super likely, but I do think it's at least possible. Now let's briefly talk about visors in the Metroid Prime series. I actually had a video where I talked about how they could sort of update and change around the scan visor in the Metroid series, and I think there are ways to streamline the scan visor into the combat visor to make things faster paced, and I think there's definitely some options there. But there's another visor I actually want to focus on, and that's the command visor. We got to see the command visor in Metroid Prime 3. You see, with the command visor, you actually use it to command your ship. And we've never really gotten to use Samus' ship too much aside from Metroid Prime 3, and even in Metroid Prime 3, you couldn't actually fly it yourself. So maybe through the command visor, you can gain more options and maybe even use your ship to traverse the game world. Which brings me to my next point. What kind of game world are we actually going to be exploring? Is it going to be one giant big planet, or is it going to be several mini planets? It's hard to say for sure, but I did put a poll up, and the two most likely options seem to be one giant big planet or one sort of open world space environment that has a few different smaller planets. So first let's focus on what I feel is the most likely scenario, and that's one big planet. So if the command visor gets some more improvements, maybe we could use the command visor to actually access Samus' ship, and maybe in some cases actually fly. So how exactly would flying go about? Could you just fly around the entire game world? I think they would probably limit it, because in my opinion, I don't really think that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be a full-on open world like Breath of the Wild, where we can go from one point to another and there's no limitations. I think there's going to be some limitations as to where you can go about. Because here's the thing, while I do think Metroid Prime 4 is going to be more bigger and open than previous Metroid games, I think there's still going to be a lot of those corridors, those labyrinth-like areas where you have to go door to door and explore in that way. I don't think it's going to all just be one giant open area they can sort of go through. There's going to be a lot of maze-like structures to go through, because that's a big part of what the Metroid series is. That said, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be some big open spaces, and maybe there could be some areas where you can traverse between one area and another on your ship. If we look at the original Metroid Prime, there were a few different actual areas, so maybe you could use your ship in Metroid Prime 4 to fly between these big different areas. That could be one way to sort of close the gap and sort of quickly travel throughout the game world without actually offering any form of fast travel or warping. And actually, on that note, one thing they could offer is fast travel. We haven't gotten fast travel in previous Metroid games as far as I'm aware. I can't think of any situation where we've actually had fast traveling in a Metroid Prime game, so maybe they could offer fast travel in Metroid Prime 4. Personally, I would much prefer to fly through my ship. I'm okay with a little bit of traversal between areas. That, for me, kind of just makes things more interesting. And in terms of traversal and progression, I do feel like overall what's going to happen is that it won't be a straight linear experience like it was in Metroid Prime 3. It's going to be more open, and they're going to offer more options. Even with Metroid Prime 1, unless you were sequence breaking, you basically would fight the bosses and get the power-ups in the exact same pattern every time. But in Metroid Prime 4, I think they're going to offer a few different ways to actually go about doing that. I think there could be several different patterns, and in that way, it could be a lot more interesting, and it could offer a lot more replayability to the game. So maybe some people end up fighting the Omega Pirate before Flagra, but then others may fight, I don't know, Thardus before they fight Kraid or something along those lines, and it can sort of change up, and you know, there'll be different ways to go about beating the game. I think that's a possibility. I think they might go ahead and do that, because in this day and age, having more open like experiences seem to be the better way to go. And for the Metroid series, that could be really interesting. So I'm not suggesting that the game should be straight up open, but to offer different patterns they can sort of take to beat the game, that might be something that a lot of Metroid fans will really appreciate. Now, going back to the planet thing, I do want to briefly talk about multiple planets. So if they were to do multiple planets, which I do think is at least a possibility, although not likely, when we look at Metroid Prime 1, we got one planet, right? And in Metroid Prime 2, we traversed between two different realms, which basically, in my opinion, is kind of like two planets. And then in Metroid Prime 3, we had a few different planets, but the game became very linear, partially due to that, but you couldn't actually access your ship and there was no open world space travel. Kind of a cool idea. What if there were, say, maybe just 3 big planets with some space stations and a few little asteroids to sort of traverse and explore, but you could actually use your ship to freely explore this small little solar system where you can access these few different planets, space stations, and comets. And when you're in space, it actually is kind of like an open world space travel environment. But when you fly into the atmospheres for these particular planets, it then transitions to something that's a bit more structured, because I do think there needs to be a bit more structure when it comes to the exploration for the actual traditional gameplay for Metroid games. To me, that'd be really cool to offer some open world space travel, but still have your labyrinth-like, maze-like environments when you're actually on the planets. That would be really cool. And I do want to stress that I do think there's going to be some big open environments, but still they're going to stick to that traditional Metroid gameplay when you're essentially digging deeper and deeper into these areas and exploring through these labyrinths and mazes and old ruins and alien-like environments. That's something that I think is really important for the Metroid series, and I think they will maintain that. So, in conclusion, bringing it all together, I think what's going to happen is they're going to offer many different ways to go about exploring the game world and traversing and progressing through the game. I think there's going to be a few different ways to go about completing the game. You're not necessarily going to get the same power-ups and fight the same bosses in the exact same way every single time. I think there's going to be some variance with that. I think maybe they could introduce Zero Suit Samus as a stealth option. I want to stress that there would be an option, not necessarily the way to go about doing things. Maybe you could also do more things as a morph ball. Maybe, you know, you focus mostly in first person, but I also think they could implement even more third person elements to definitely open up the platforming and the speed of the game. I think they could help out a lot to bring in more players, and I think a lot more players will really appreciate it. And I want to stress that none of these things would make the game easier or more casual, because I know a lot of people are concerned about that. Look at Super Mario Odyssey and look at Breath of the Wild. I think most Mario and Zelda fans would agree that these games have plenty of challenge, if not more so than their predecessors. But they're also a lot more inviting to a lot more players. There is a way to make games more inviting to more people without just straight up making them easier, and I think they're going to do something similar with the Metroid series as well. So there's a way that both sides can be happy. We can have our cake and eat it too, at least in this scenario, I think. So overall, I feel like Metroid Prime 4 is going to have more options, and I think that's going to be a really cool thing. I think it's going to help the Metroid Prime series to expand and grow, and because of this, there will be a lot more Metroid fans, so we can continue to talk about the Metroid series. But anyways, everyone, those are my thoughts on how I think they can go about changing and improving the movement and exploration for Metroid Prime 4. Do you guys think anything could be different? Do you have any other ideas on how they can improve the Metroid series? Let me know in the comments below. But that's all for now, everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all really soon. Bye.